Hi everyone, Professor King here. Today, or in this video, I'm going to be talking about rhetorical analysis, which is chapter 6 in Everything's an Argument. So I won't belabor any points. I'm just going to jump right to a share screen so that we can access this and talk about it. So chapter 6 is incredibly important. Because this is essentially what you do in the majority of essays you write for any class, not just for this one, but for classes in general. So a rhetorical analysis, is essentially the cornerstone of what we do when we write, when we read other texts, when we're responding to other texts, and then we write about them. Remember, rhetoric means the art of persuasion, the art of argument, and analysis, at its most basic definition, means taking a whole, breaking it down into its component parts, and seeing how they essentially work together. But it's not just the whole and the component parts, it's also things like context, history, biography of the writer, purpose, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, we're analyzing argument, right? We're picking apart argument and we're responding to it, which then becomes an argument of our own. So rhetorical analysis is a close reading of a text to find how and to what extent it persuades. And since everything is an argument, right, like chapter 1 in the textbook so clearly states, anything we look at can be analyzed rhetorically, okay? That includes advertisements, that includes cartoons, that includes artwork, songs, movies, pieces of writing, etc. So when we say something like close reading, really what we're talking about is rhetorical analysis, because we're not just reading for a summary. We're not just reading to then regurgitate back and say, this is what happened in the text. At this point now, we've got to do something with that. So the example I always like to use that'll help you remember like what a rhetorical analysis is in everyday life is think about when you watch a movie with your friends, whether you go to the theater or maybe you watch a movie, in your living room together, and the movie ends. And, let's say you really enjoyed the movie and your friend really hated it. What is the first thing that you do once the movie's over? After you eat and use the bathroom or whatever you have to do, right? You talk about it. At least a lot of people do, right? And maybe even if you don't talk about it with your friend, you're thinking about it. And what happens in those conversations is analysis, right? Is a rhetorical analysis of the text that's being shared. So, for example, I'm trying to think of a movie that came out recently. Like I know a few years ago, the Avengers saga, right, was really big. And so imagine if you walked out of an Avengers movie and you just said, you start talking to your friend, you guys have your sodas or your veggie sticks in your hand or whatever, and you say, yeah, so that movie, what did you think about it? And your friend just looks at you and says, well, the Avengers series is about characters from a certain comic book universe in which a villain by the name of Thanos starts to terrorize the universe by trying to kill half of the population. After Thanos does this, the Avengers by that point, you're tuned out, right? Because your first thing that you'll say to your friend is, yeah, I know, we just both watched the same movie. Why are you just summarizing it for me, right? The exact same thing happens for students who are unsure or who lack confidence in their writing, right? If they read a text and they're asked to analyze it, their sort of knee-jerk response is to just summarize it. Well, the problem with that is, like I said, we've both already read it. We've both seen the movie, right? So you have to go beyond just doing that because your audience is going to go, yeah, I know, right? Like, what do you have to say about it, right? So then a rhetorical analysis would look something like, yeah, in the last scene of the final chapter in the saga where they all start fighting Thanos and then the women come in and it's clearly, right? It's clearly a reference to the Trump presidency because they use language that's been very common in our sort of political atmosphere in the last few years. And they even use the word Trump when they're referring to Thanos and all these sorts of things, right? And I thought that was, either too obvious or I thought it was really cool because I agree with it politically, or I thought it was kind of irrelevant to the rest of the conversation of the movie or whatever. That's rhetorical analysis, right? That's when you start taking examples, right? When they're fighting Thanos, when all the female heroes come in, you know, when they start to use the language that's employed, et cetera, et cetera. Now you're taking those parts of the text and you're doing something with it. You're creating a new argument, which is to say, you know, here's what I think, here's my response, here's my opinion, my critical brain responding to this text, right? So it's beyond just summary. It's taking aspects of the text and having something to say about them. I'll try and draw, you know, I know everyone loves my drawings, and so I'm just gonna keep going with it, because, you know, like, how much more hideous can they get? But the example I like to always use about argument is that of the Janus-faced person. Janus. So Janus is this, you know, mythological character who has two faces, right? Who can look toward the past and toward the future. And really what we're doing in argument is we're doing exactly that with texts, right? We're having conversations, in other words. Where'd my cursor go? There it is. No, there you are, there you are, there you are. Okay. So we're having these conversations. So let's say, and this is my drawing of a person, so please bear with me, right? But let's say this person that I just drew here is the original arguer, right? They say, whoops, like they tell their argument to an audience, right? And they have, you know, whatever their argument is, whatever text they've created deliberately, whether it's a painting or a speech or a novel or, you know, a debate, they're creating that argument. And then they have people who, again, horrible drawing. I understand. I'm not aware of this, right? Then they have, this is a person's face, by the way. Then they have a person who's listening to that argument, right? So that person digests, let's call this person 2, right? Person 2 digests person 1's argument, and then guess what they do? Where'd you go? Oh. They turn around. They turn around. Oh gosh. And this same person, oh gosh. This same person from here, right? This is the same guy. Then that person who hears the argument turns around and says to somebody else, you know, here's what I think of person 1's argument, right? So person 1's argument gets heard by person 2. Person 2 then turns around and tells person 3 what they think of that argument, right? And so on and so on and so forth, you know, throughout the history of time. So I'm gonna get out of the text if I can. If not, no big deal. So yeah, so, you know, if we think about argument in those terms, then we can, if we think about argument in those terms, then we can see, right, how some of these conversations about civics, about movies, about art, about politics, gender, race, class, biology, science, et cetera, how they've been going on forever and ever and ever, right? And sometimes you have way more than just one person talking to another, right? You have multiple people having a conversation at any given time, right? But all argument, all we're doing is engaging in that conversation, right? Whether it's a one-to-one, right? Like if I read a book and I read an argument out of this book and then I have something to say about it, I write an essay about it, I'm responding, right? I'm having a conversation with the person who created this text. But then let's say a professor is going to grade my essay, and that professor's not only read this book, but has now read my argument. They're going to critique what I have to say. So then they're involved in that conversation, right? And let's say I workshop it with my classmates, or I even eventually maybe publish it in a student paper or a publication. Then that audience gets exponentially larger, right? And we're all having that conversation about that topic. So, again, if we take it back to the movie metaphor, right? If someone walks into that conversation and then just starts summarizing Avengers, everyone else in that conversation is going to look at that person like, what are you doing? We all saw the movie, right? So we have to dig deeper than that. We have to follow every lead and dig deeply into the text. But that doesn't mean we have to address every single thing in the text. We just address the things that our eye as the perceiving audience is drawn to. And then when we become the creator of the text, the rhetor, right, then those are the things those will be the subjects of our text, right? So you have to ask yourself, what strategies of pathos, ethos, and logos is the text that I'm looking at that I'm going to respond to? What strategies does the writer employ, right, that I'm going to respond to? And why do I think that person used, this emotion to glom onto? Why does this person mention, X type of research that she did, or her credentials in this? What are these logical steps, these syllogisms, and these enthymemes that she's employing? And do they make sense? So again, we're looking at how all the components work together to persuade an audience. And when you're writing essays, right, like the ones you just finished, you're doing the same thing, right? You are saying, okay, does my structure work? Are my sentences clear? Do I have a good argument? Do I have an argument at all? Did I do proper research? Is my punctuation correct? Is my formatting correct? Am I analyzing enough? You're doing all of these separate components in an essay at the same time. And it's my job, right, then as your audience to analyze how that's all working, right? The same thing you're doing to the text you're reading, I'm doing as an audience to your text, right? We're in this scholarly academic milieu now where the expectations are higher, the standards are higher, but also the output is more impressive, right? It's a challenge, and it's a great challenge. So one thing you want to do is you want to be able to ask the right questions, right? The right rhetorical questions. And these questions are going to be different depending on which page you're using. I'll take it off stop share really quickly. But if you have, and I know I'm so sorry that my computer screen is hideous, like just awful. But if you can see the section that's called composing a rhetorical analysis, and then beneath that, there's all these bullet points of questions that you have, right? In certain books, it's on different pages. It might be like 89 to 90 or 92 to 93, depending on which edition you have. But those questions are great guiding questions for rhetorical analysis, right? What authorities does the argument rely on to appeal to? Who's the audience, right? What claims does the argument make? What issues are raised, or what's ignored and evaded, right? There's so many different ones there that you can use when you're conducting a rhetorical analysis, and just apply them into your essay, right? You also need to show how the strategies, if you're composing a rhetorical analysis, you need to show how the strategies of argument help or hurt the piece of writing, right? Maybe, in the Avengers example, right? Maybe the present day political references just don't do it for you, and you talk about why, right? And as long as you have valid reasons to back it up, there's no right or wrong answer, right? It's just a well-supported argument or one that's not well-supported. You have to show readers why the argument does or does not work and where it fails, right? Kind of along those same lines. And ultimately, your analysis should become an argument of its own. Again, if we think about that Janus-faced example, where person one has an argument and person two hears it or reads it, and then person two turns around and tells that argument to person three, then this person's going to have a response, right? It's going to keep happening through, indefinitely. But we're listening, and then we're creating an argument of our own. We're listening and reading, observing, watching, digesting the information, thinking about how we think about it and feel about it intellectually and emotionally, and then we compose our own argument about it, right? Which moves us into the future. So next we have to think about purpose, right? Why was this text created? Why was this argument written? Why was this painting drawn? Why was this film made, right? What is the writer, or really the rhetor, right? The person creating the text, what's the writer's end game? Meaning, why? Why is this person telling me this? When you're reading a text, when you're watching a film, when you're observing data, when you're doing anything, again, unlock that inner 5-year-old and say, why, right? Why is it that way? Why are you telling me this? Why do I need to know this? And a lot of times we do that sarcastically, right? We do that ironically, like, ugh, why do I have to learn about blah, blah, blah in this college class? And we never really fully answer that question. We just leave it hanging in the air. But you have to have more respect for text than that. Even if it's a challenging class, even if it's a class that, you know, you're never going to think about after you leave in 16 weeks or whatever, you have to date that thing for the moment, right? You have to respect it on its own terms, at least for the time that you have with it. So at least give it that respect in that moment, because then you start to learn all sorts of things that you never even allowed yourself to consider before, right? Oh, if Avengers is trying to tell me something about the Trump regime, right? Through this saga, through this extended narrative of all of these superheroes and all of these different villains and abilities and challenges, right? Like, why is that important for me to know as an American citizen? What's the director trying to get me to think, do, believe, or feel? Is it to vote, right? Is it to, you know, to vote Democrat, right? Like, what is it? And then you start to go, oh man, that's so much more than just a movie, right? It's so much more than just plot devices and narrative. It's an argument, right? It's a text that is doing so many different things, and they did that on purpose. So then you have to ask who makes the argument, right? And do your research to discover whether the writer you're reading has the authority to make the claims that she's making, right? You know, the kiss of death is if I, as your reader, ask you, okay, well, what do you know about this writer? And you say, oh, they wrote this book, right? Like, they wrote this article I'm reading. That's not enough, right? You know, I could trick you. I could give you a reading from like Hitler's Mein Kampf and not give you an author. And some of you might walk away from it going, well, I could see, you know, like, know who the person writing the material is, because then if you find out that they're, you know, a neo-Nazi, or they're, you know, one of the Proud Boys, or they, you know, they hate women's rights, right, or they're homophobic or transphobic, then you're going to be like, ooh, like, maybe I should take this argument a little bit differently than I'm taking it. So that is on you as the reader to do. That's not on me as your teacher to make sure you know everything about every single author. That's on you, the discerning reader, to say, okay, I have this text, maybe I agree with a lot of it, but I gotta be skeptical, and I gotta find out who the heck is telling me this stuff. Because if it's just some yokel from down the street, or if it's from someone who has an abysmal worldview that's trying to get me to their side, and I'm convinced, I gotta think about why. Right? So that is incredibly important as well, to know who the heck is telling you this stuff. So when we think about arguments, right, most arguments are composed with a specific audience in mind. Think about it, the last message you sent to your grandmother or your parent or your guardian, and then think about the last message, the last thing you talked about with your best friend, or in those private chat rooms you don't want anyone to know about you're going to, right? Chat rooms, gosh, that's so early 2000s. The audiences are different. So the things you say are going to be different. The language you use is going to be different. To one, maybe you swear and sound like a sailor. To the other, you sound like the most proper, perfect angel out there, right? you're doing these things in your daily lives. You just have to see now that those skills can be finessed and zhuzhed and made more sophisticated for a scholarly audience, right? The fact that you use a different language for your grandma or your auntie or whoever else that then you'll use for your best friend or your partner, right? That's showing that you make deliberate decisions when you are constructing your own texts. Even if the texts you're constructing are, you know, like not grammatically correct or not, you know, academic, doesn't matter. You're still applying these skill sets that when you bring them to the academic environment, we make them academic, right? So think about who you're talking to. Think about what they want to hear. Think about how you're going to best persuade them. Think about ethos, pathos, logos. Think about where they're coming from. Where's your audience coming from? What's their political background? What's their cultural background, right? Like you have to start thinking about, how am I going to persuade this person the best I can with the knowledge I have of them? And sometimes that knowledge is more readily available than at other times, right? I'm clearly going to know more about perhaps a family member or a friend and about where they're coming from than I will appear in my classroom or my professor, right? That doesn't mean pander to strangers. There's nothing I hate more than when people write essays because they think, you know, it's what I believe, because usually they're wrong. And usually it comes off as pandering, right? It comes off as kind of cheap and it's not what they really feel. So I would rather you construct something that you care about, but keep your audience in mind than to try and be cheap and pander, right? So rhetorical analysis gauges the success of strategies, content, tone, and language when received by such audiences. In other words, if it's a flop, you can kind of tell when it's a flop, right? Like if a film is a flop or a song sucks or, you know, viral video is stupid or something, like you can tell. Whereas when something is done very successfully, right, you can tell that as well. There's an old saying about style, which is, and we'll get to style in a moment, but good style, you know it when you see it, right? And bad style, you know it when you see it. But there are all these different aspects, right? Content, tone, strategy, skills, language, structure, mechanics, overall argument, etc., that go into that when it's done well, it's effortless, right? It seems effortless. It's not. It takes a lot of work, right? But it seems effortless. So let's talk about arguments based on emotion. They don't always just prey on your emotions, right? Pathos doesn't always just prey on your emotions, but also that which makes you susceptible and vulnerable. And this is incredibly, incredibly important in this day and age, because we have a lot of information out there, right? The 24-hour news cycle, fake news, et cetera, whatever else comes to mind, right? That ability for certain outlets of information to deceive their audiences with false information or misinformation or not fully factual information, or conspiratorial information, pseudoscience, all of those sorts of things, right? The reason why that stuff is so big right now is because we are being inundated constantly. And a lot of those people who are disseminating their information right now are doing it knowing that it's going to slip through the cracks for some of us, right? So things like, the anti-vax movement, let's use that as an example, right? The anti-vax movement is, it's definitely minimized over the last few years, but back, probably when I was fresh out of college, it was probably at its acme of people believing, that vaccines cause autism, which has been overwhelmingly thoroughly debunked in scientific study over, and not just by someone saying I don't believe it, but in double-blind, disinterested, objective, scientific study over and over and over and over again, right? But if we're getting our information from memes or from blogs or from sources whose reputability we can't discern, then again, some of that stuff filters through. And when we're hearing so much information at the same time, sometimes we go, oh, shoot, I shouldn't vaccinate my kids because what if they get autism? Because I didn't take the time to research this source and find out if it was reliable or credible. That's preying on my inability, the lack of time I have, whatever it is, my fear, right, to get me to do what they want. And so then I don't vaccinate my kid. Then my kid goes to high school, contracts whooping cough or the measles or polio or the plague, right? These things that have been essentially eradicated from the face of the earth. And then I go, oh, dang, my kid, you know, is very ill, if not dead now, because I listened to this pseudoscience. That made me susceptible and vulnerable, right? That made me feel a certain way, and I acted on it without doing the proper research. So when we talk about ethos, people think about like anger, they think about fear, they think about comedy, right? Like Mr. Michael Che here. But also things that make us vulnerable, right? The things we don't know, the things that we are ignorant about and are afraid to say we're ignorant about. But that's why we have to do research. That's why we have to say, be okay with saying, I don't know, let me find out. Okay, so the writer's strategy with pathos is essentially to distract the audience just enough to sway them to his or her opinion. Again, before I mentioned a Leith reading that you didn't do from Words Like Loaded Pistols, but Leith says that, you know, comedy is affirmative consent, right? Like where, or not affirmative consent, but comedy is a passive way of affirming consent, right? Because if I'm laughing at what you're saying, I'm kind of smiling and agreeing with you. So that comedians know that, and they want to share these sort of truths about the world, but they want people to agree with their point of view. Because if I'm a comedian and I'm saying a bunch of stuff that everyone disagrees with, my comedy's not going to go very far, right? So they're using that as a way to sort of distract just enough to get you to believe their opinion, right? But you always have to ask yourself, do the emotions incited in the text language advance the claims or do they hurt the claims, right? Like think of all the Karen videos out there, the Karen videos, right? When you see those Karens, like Karens screaming at people or, you know, crying at people who are acting totally innocuously and calmly, you know, and they're saying like, oh, you're attacking me. And the person's 30 feet away saying, I'm not attacking you. I'm literally just holding my phone, you know, so that you don't do anything to get me unsafe, right? But then the Karen will say like, oh, you're attacking me. Oh, I'm going to hide my license plate or whatever, right? One of the things that we kind of mock, right, about those women, right, particularly those white women, is that the emotions inciting by the text, by the things they're saying, they don't advance the claim, right? The claim that's being made is ridiculous usually, and the sort of over emoting is also ridiculous in that so then it just becomes this sort of like nuclear bomb of ridiculousness, right? And the problem is that, you know, had those cameras not been there and that person would have been taken seriously, then the person filming might have been in a lot of danger, right? And so that's why pathos sometimes is incredibly important, because, you know, if it's put in the wrong hands, or if it's to achieve the, you know, immoral or unethical, to achieve those ends, it can be very dangerous. All right, let's move on to ethos. Again, ethos is all about trustworthiness. And so trustworthiness, think about people who are trustworthy in your life. How did they become trustworthy? I'm sure that the answer that's coming to your mind has something to do with consistency, right? You didn't just like meet someone who smiled at you once and go, okay, here are the keys to my car, right? Like you learned how to trust them because they consistently showed you a behavior that allowed you to feel that way, to feel that safety, right? The audience needs that same level of safety when we're looking at an argument. Well, how does the audience looking at an academic argument feel safe, right? Feel safe with the information that's being given to them. And here is the number one way. the writer put in a lot of work. The writer put in a lot of the right kind of work to create that text and to disseminate that information. Well, what is the right kind of work? The right kind of work is doing adequate research, using sources that are valid, avoiding Google, using sources from people who they have researched and made sure that those people were reputable and reliable. That person has a body of research, right? Not just in that writing, but in all of their writings and all of their efforts, whether it be within a class, multiple classes, multiple degrees, multiple credentials, whatever. They've consistently shown that they can meet those benchmarks. Here's why that's important. That person knows that they have to be taken seriously in a particular environment, let's say the academic environment, right? So if they want to be taken seriously, they're not going to do the things that people aren't going to take seriously, right? If I get students every semester who I keep telling, do not use Google for your academic sources, and guess what they do? They keep using Google to get their academic sources. Guess what happens? Their argument suffers severely as a result. And here's why. They didn't do the work to show, hey, I have a compelling argument and I'm smart, and I'm, you know, I not only think that I'm smart, but I've been engaging with all these other researchers who are also consistently trustworthy in their research to support my point, right? It's not enough anymore to just say, here's how I feel. It's here's how I feel, and here is the evidence to back it up, right? And here's why it's important. Those 3 things we do in a body paragraph, right? So be consistent. Be consistent in your tone of vocabulary, in your research, in your arguments, right? And in your own body of work, right? None of us are like researchers or writers yet, but everything we do, from essay to essay, from class to class, if we consistently engage in the process, if we consistently meet the standards required of us, then we do become those consistent, trustworthy people. It's a step-by-step process. It doesn't happen overnight, but we have to keep at it. We have to maintain it, right? So keep that in mind. And then finally, arguments based on facts and reason, logos, right? How do we rhetorically analyze those? Because those are going to be the bulk of what we look at when we're looking at argument, right? You know, look over the argument. Is it plausible? Is it reliable? Is it believable? Based on the other things we've already talked about: research, content, structure, clarity, tone, vocabulary, style, et cetera, et cetera. Ask yourself, is the evidence current, accurate, and relevant, and of a high quality, right? We're going to be talking very soon about the CRAP test, right? If you've heard about the CRAP test before, maybe in your English 100 class, you know that, you know, when you're doing research, you have to have research that's up to date if we're talking current events, that is reliable. We just talked about that earlier in this video. That is accurate, right? That isn't pseudoscience or misinformation. And that is relevant and of good quality, right? And not only to do that for one source, but to do it for all of your sources. And then the last question, right? To have a range of sources. If all you do is stack the deck, right? That logical fallacy, stacking the deck. If all you do is stack the deck in favor of one side, you're not a researcher, you're a cheerleader, right? And I talked about that in the last video. Nothing wrong with being a cheerleader, but a cheerleader's job at the end of the day is to root for the team, even if they see the team losing by 70 points. Now, your job as a researcher is, if you see an argument losing by a proverbial 70 points, you have to take a step back and say, am I going to root for this thing? Because that doesn't seem plausible, right? Like, or do I take a step back, reassess, and go from there, pivot and go from there, right? You're not a cheerleader, you're a researcher. You can do that, right? Cheerleaders can't do that because that's not in their job description. They have to support no matter what, no matter how dire their team is doing, right? They got to support. You're not a cheerleader, you're a researcher, right? If that's your baby and you love it so much, but it's not working, got to take a step back and pivot, right? You got to reassess. So make sure you're doing that by being objective, by finding a lot of research, by finding research that you disagree with, opinions that challenge you, that you maybe don't even fully understand, right? Do all of that. And then just kind of some final things to consider, right? Structure, when you're writing your own rhetorical analysis, how are you going to structure your essay? You know, you've got the thesis in the intro and then the body paragraphs in the conclusion, right? According to the visual map. And as we'll see this week, according to kind of Cicero's tradition of arguing, right? You got transitions, maybe looking at headings and subheadings within the text to help guide, right? Making sure that all sources that are mentioned in the body of the essay are documented properly according to MLA formatting, and making sure that you have an academic tone, right? None of this is news, so I'm just gonna, be quick with that. And I think this is the last slide, right? And so finally, style, right? Again, like I said, we know bad style when we see it. We know good style when we see it. And it seems as though it's effortlessly done, but it actually takes a lot of work. Anyone in the fashion industry, anyone who does like makeup tutorials or contouring, anyone who, has ever dressed themselves to put out a certain image, right? Like, we know it's not just like, oh, clothes fell on me and everything's perfect. It's like we had to, express our body in a certain way, wear a certain color, wear a certain fabric for this context because I want to put off this impression in a business meeting, but this impression at a barbecue, et cetera, et cetera. That's style, right? And in writing, we have style. We have things that show that we can make those really fancy moves, right? Like varying our sentence length, using things like alliteration, right? Parallelism, rhythm, right? Referring back to some of this stuff that we learned in high school and maybe our junior and senior classes that help us to see that writing is not just this dull, dry thing, but there's actually a lot of beauty to it, an art to it, right? And so if you can kind of make your academic writing also sound engaging by utilizing that. And for everybody, that's going to look different. We each have our own individual writing voice. So it's not like we have to do all of these things, and it's not like we have to do them all in the same proportions. But we find what works for us in terms of style, and we go with it, right? I know some people who write very simplistic, clear, basic sentence structures, and that's their signature style. I am a person who writes those really long, sort of winding sentences, and then I try to break them up with shorter sentences so that it creates variety for my reader, right? Whatever the case may be, find your voice, find your style, have the confidence in it. Sorry, I took it off the share screen. Have the confidence in it and go with it, because the confidence is what's going to help you pass the class, right? People think like, oh, I'm not a good writer, right? You are, you just have to stop thinking about it and do it. And then when you think about it is when you clean it up with the revision and the editing and the adding afterward, right? So I hope that was helpful in terms of rhetorical analysis. There are definitely going to be opportunities for rhetorical analysis this week, so keep that in mind. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, and I will see you in cyberspace soon. Bye.